folks, welcome back inside the Parisi Palace high above 2919 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show. The truth about life is that it's not fair, nor is it unfair. You create your own world, incubate in that world, and then unleash your true nature onto society. It's not a power trip. It's the idea of being able to navigate through rough waters, look up when the chips are down, and don't blow all your money up your nose. My guest today has managed and promoted some of the most iconic bands in rock history. It started with the Rolling Stones in England, but when they came to Altamont, things took a turn. Not fair or unfair, just a paradigm shift, which featured the flowering of a relationship with the late, great Jerry Garcia. No more talking. Sam Cutler, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Good morning.
How are you, sir?
Good morning, and hello to you and to your millions of listeners all over the globe.
Millions, baby, millions. Sam, it is great to connect with you. I wanted to talk to you about when you were growing up in London. I've talked to a lot of the cats that came of age in the rock scene or the music scene in the late 60s, and they were tremendously inspired by the beat writers and poets in America. But I wanted to know who you were inspired by, the beat poets and writers in England.
Well, it's interesting that you should ask that. My mother was very left-wing, and she was very into progressive American writers. Steinbeck, Hemingway, John Dos Passos, people like this. And I was raised in a house full of books, and so my reading for an Englishman was pretty eclectic. I was involved in American literature and just working class literature in general. By the time I was a teenager, I was well versed in all things American. My mother was also mad for folk music, English and American, and particularly working class songs, union songs. So I was also raised on Woody Guthrie and knew all of his songs and knew all the songs of the Wobblies. So I was pretty steeped in American culture without ever going to America, as were many people in England at the end of the Second World War. You have to remember that in the Second World War, England's butt was basically saved by the intervention of America in the war.
Right.
If it hadn't been for America, England would have lost the war. So America was cool, I mean, lots of things came from America, from chewing gum to all kinds of, to candy. Candy wasn't really an English thing as such, I mean, there's no such thing as, racks of candy like you see in stores today. It was very poor in England after the war. We were bombed flat. There was rationing, there was no sugar, no treats for kids. It was a tough life. So into all of this mix, came rock and roll. It was like a breath of fresh air, another great thing that America gave to Europe and the West. So we had a very good, positive view of America at the end of the Second World War, helped by Bill Haley and Elvis Presley.
Well, it was the
people like that.
Sure, I mean it was the burgeoning rock scene, Little Richard and Elvis and those cats. But I just wanted you to talk about. You talked about your mom being a progressive woman, but I mean, can you talk about some of the indigenous progressive writers and poets that you got off on that were in England at that time?
Right. Well, the English cultural scene following the Second World War was kind of battered, to say the least. I'm trying to think now. I mean, when one read what one read in England as a young kid, at school, in the years following the Second World War, in the 40s and 50s, people were still being fed Shakespeare and
right.
And Charles Dickens and people like that, and the classical English poets, from Byron to Shelley, etc. The kind of beat English writers didn't really appear in in a kind of significant sense, you know, until the 60s. Working class, it wasn't, you know, working class people weren't really riders.
Right.
In England. There wasn't a kind of blue-collar riding thing like existed in America. There wasn't that feeling in England that anybody could be a rider. You know what I mean? You had to come from a certain kind of social class.
A pedigree, yeah.
And
absolutely.
have a certain level of education in order to be a rider. Working class riders like Alan Siliso or somebody like that, they didn't come through until maybe the middle to the end of the 50s. So I wasn't, you know, that exposed to contemporary writing and poetry in England, for sure. There wasn't much of it. You know, it's a very minor, small part of the English scene. It's hard for people in England in America, to imagine what England was like at the end of the Second World War.
I really appreciate. No, I mean it's
virtually.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say everyone was virtually starving, man. It was very grey, very doom-laden kind of environment, and I mean that was one of the reasons why rock and roll, you know, was so influential, had such an effect. It came as a breath of fresh air. We didn't have the so-called like golden Eisenhower years in England.
Right. No, this is...
We had rationing, you know, and we had, the Marshall Plan that saved Europe from starvation. 1948, for example, was the coldest year in something like 200 years. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people died. You know, there was starvation in Holland, in France. In England, people, it was touch and go. And the Americans came to the rescue, basically. They won the war with their manpower and their productive power, their factories and, you know, blood and treasure, you know, and after the war, they helped Europe get back on its feet again. So, as I say, everyone was very pro-American. I mean, I can remember to this day listening to Heartbreak Hotel. My cousin Ian played it on a record player. It was it was a revelation.
Would you say that
I didn't want to be involved in music?
Was it just the upbeat mentality of rock and roll, just the fact that it was so, with the rationing and the depression? I mean, you guys were. There's two questions here. Not only did America save England in the war, did they also help rebuild England? I mean, did they physically have people over there rebuilding your country?
I don't think they physically helped in that sense, but, you know, they got the banks working again, and, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and
right.
Paid off, forgave the war debts and all kinds of stuff like that, and generally assisted in the relaunching of British industry and German industry, everybody else, you know. I mean, people had to work, people had to feed themselves, so the Americans definitely played a fact. My wife, bless her, thank you. I want to tell the world my wife just made me a cup of tea.
Oh, thank you.
Very
I love her.
Here. We're
I love
in Australia.
her.
we should tell your listeners around the globe that we're here in Australia. So here it's 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning.
My wife always asks me
early times.
My wife says, "Why do you need to do your show on Saturday?" I said, "Because I'm interviewing Sam Cutler in Australia on Sunday. That's why. You know, I mean, it's really."
That's right.
It's a high honor to talk to you.
It's funny, isn't it?
I want to ask you. So, you know, there was sort of this mentality of like in England where, you know, there was no blue collar. You couldn't be blue collar and you couldn't be a writer. Did that change in the 60s? Like, how much were you impacted by a cat like Aldous Huxley and Doors of Perception?
It did change. I don't think the Doors of Perception had a massive effect on the you know British popular culture. The thing about England that I think that changed was that for the first time there existed this class of people called teenagers. That was very novel. Nobody, you know, teenagers were kind of invented
right
in the 40s.
Wow, this is cool.
You know, we didn't exist before then. So, of course, that went down very well with all the people that happened to be between the age of 12 and 20, you know. And they, of course, that was the age that the music business, you know, aimed itself at. You know, the Elvis Presleys of this world certainly aimed themselves at that demographic, you know. So we were all of a sudden here was something that came down the road that was specifically for young people. So in England, of course, that the rock and roll scene was preceded by what was called skiffle. You didn't really have that in America. You know, the closest thing that you would have would be kind of the jug band scene.
Absolutely.
In England, there was a big thing of guitars. The guitar was introduced into popular culture by the Americans, you know. So everybody wanted to play guitar in the skiffle group. And skiffle group was like, you know, a guitar player, a stand-up bass that would be like a tea chest with a stick on top of it and a string, you know, homemade bass.
I love it.
A washboard.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Everybody for a while was playing. There was a guy called Lonnie Donegan. Everybody was playing that stuff. And he played like kind of novelty songs. I can remember one was called "Does Your Chewing Gum Lose Its Flavor on the Bedpost Overnight?" Silly kind of novelty songs like that. And then, of course, then the big boys came along. Elvis Presley came along, and yeah.
I sat on, the first show was Toronto, and I sat on Levon's drum riser and sat there with my mouth open and listened to him sing, "Building to Nazareth, I was feeling about 8:30," and playing drums. I'm like, who the hell is this guy? This guy's amazing. This band, and every time they finished a song, they would switch instruments.
Right,
you know, they go from drums
right.
to mandolin. And then the keyboard player will come over and play drums. It's like, these guys are amazing. And then Janice, and it was, you know, and then I met Weir and Jerry, and we became the Three Musketeers on the train.
Really?
Yes.
I love that you got.
Weir became really good friends right on the spot. And I see this beautiful girl on the train. I'm 20 years old, and I'm after this girl named Frankie. The whole tour, she's just teasing me. So, into the tour, we're all saying goodbye, and Bobby goes, "Hey, how'd you do with Frankie?" I go, "Oh, man, she just was playing with me." He goes, "Good, that's my old lady." I go, "Well, why the hell did you tell me?"
All right, he was referring to the Festival Express. Do you know who that was?
Yeah. Who it was, I wasn't entirely clear. It was hard to hear.
I
Tell
know.
me.
No, it was Kenny Gradney, who was with Delaney and Bonnie at the time, eventually became the bass player for Little Feat. But that was his first trip on the Festival Express through Toronto. He was talking about being on the stage and the drum riser. It was the first time he saw the band.
Right.
And I'd like you to talk.
Right.
Yeah, and then he was hitting on Bobby's girlfriend the whole time, Bob Weir, and he didn't make it anywhere. But I really wanted to talk to you before we get into the Festival Express. Can you talk about why you gravitated to Garcia after Altamont and the kind of relationship you guys cultivated?
Well, I mean, Altamont's always called the Rolling Stones free concert at Altamont, but actually it was the Grateful Dead's free concert at Altamont, organised by them, by and large, out of their office, with everyone invited to, be a part of it. As everybody knows, it was a disaster. It wasn't that much. It wasn't good. It wasn't a total disaster, but it certainly wasn't good. And, in the end, somebody got killed. The Rolling Stone, the Grateful Dead themselves were very embarrassed.
Right.
They didn't play, which wasn't their finest hour, to say the least. Garcia had spent a lot of energy, personal energy, on getting the thing together. He'd invited Crosby, Stills and Nash. He'd invited Santana. He'd invited Jefferson Airplane. Felt very bad about the outcome and the role of the Grateful Dead. And I was staying at Mickey's, actually, out at Mickey's farm, and immediately after Altamont, and Jerry came out there and saw me there, and we talked a little bit, and he invited, I was living in a barn at Jerry's, to Mickey's,
Sure.
and Jerry invited me to come and stay at his house with him and Mountain Girl. So then I went there, you know, and that was very good of him, you know, and we had long talks. What Jerry was very interested in was the organisation of the Rolling Stones, how the Rolling Stones managed, you know, organised a band, how a band was organised. So, you know, you couldn't go anywhere to find out these things. Mm-hmm. He was interested in that, and he was interested in what experience that the Rolling Stones had, you know, could be shared so that the Grateful Dead could basically professionalise their trip and, you know, have it a bit more together. It was all over the place, you know, and it was all over the place basically because the Grateful Dead had always been managed or looked after by their friends, you know, and not necessarily by people who really knew very much about the music business, to say the least. People that looked after the Grateful Dead knew nothing about the music business, only knew about the music business what they had managed to find out and learn, you know, being in the Grateful Dead. So Garcia wanted to expand on that and, you know, become a much more professional and together outfit. We talked about that and, you know, over many, many hours and sitting in the garden smoking joints and chatting about this, that and the other. A different picture of how to organise the Grateful Dead as a band emerged between us. And Jerry wanted me to be the tour manager and the co-manager. He wanted to have three managers, basically. They'd just been managed previously by, at the time of Altamont, by Mickey Hart's father, the Reverend Lenny Hart, who was a Christian minister that managed to rip them off for $300,000.
That's right.
So he was a dead loss, you know what I mean? And yeah, they wanted to get a bit more professional. So what they did was Jerry got a friend of his who was a kind of an accounts guy to look after the money, me to be the tour manager, and a guy called John McIntyre, who was the dishwasher at the Carousel Ballroom, basically, who knew fuck all about the music business, to be what, you know, the kind of nominal head, as it were. So there were three of us who were co-managers, although that never worked, because McIntyre tried to sabotage it from word go, basically, and you know, be considered the only kind of manager. Well, the rest of us got on and did the work, you know, and the work was, in the first year that I worked with the Grateful Dead, I think we did 180 gigs. I mean, we worked flat out. That's all we did because the band was, you know, deeply in debt. As I say, Lenny had ripped off $300,000-$400,000. There was no money. And what we had to do was work. And in order to survive, we had to work hard.
Can I?
That's
I just want to. I want to go. I want to stop.
And,
yeah. No, I really want to. This is so important because you play it off like Jerry made the decisions to have three managers. I'm sure he did. But when you sat with him for hours and hours, what did you tell him about making the Dead a more professional organization, and what did they implement that you offered them?
Well, yeah, right. I mean, these are huge conversations, man. How do you know about how it's like herding cats, isn't it? You know, how do you organise a bunch of hippies that don't want to be organised?
Right,
you know what
right.
I mean?
I know.
The $1 million question.
Well, I know. That's why I asked you.
But you know, slowly and this was, you know, my kind of role with the Grateful Dead, which didn't earn me any friends really, was that yeah, they needed to kind of change how they went about things, you know. Because the Grateful Dead were very anarchic. Anybody could take whatever drug they wanted to whenever. But, of course, at times that didn't work too well, you know, when you had a schedule to stick to. So things like timekeeping became an issue, you know, being on time, not being late, not keeping people waiting, arriving on time, doing gigs on time, always, you know, being there and delivering. And the Grateful Dead rose to the challenge, you know, and of course, there wasn't a template that they could really follow. It was just more, well, this is how these guys have done it. This is how these guys have done it. Now, this is you. You're completely different, so you're going to have to work out a uniquely Grateful Dead way of doing things, which, by and large, we did over the 4 years that I was with the Grateful Dead. They went from being kind of untogether, to be kind about it, to being a super slick, very together, very professional rock and roll band. That takes a lot of work, believe me, and a lot of brain cells.
I mean, I know Weir was consistent. I mean, even he never changed he was never on time for anything. There was no schedule book for anything. But I mean, it's interesting because
that changed.
What's interesting is that you stayed with them for these 4 years and got them so amped up and so professional that they kind of burned out. I mean, by 75, they took a break. You know, they kind of burned it so hard. But it's a testament to you because those guys. I mean, could you talk about an example of a time when you had to herd one of the cats or two of the cats and how you did it? I mean, and also my other question was Mickey kicked out of the band at that point because his dad ripped off the band?
Well, Mickey left the band because Mickey had issues with drugs,
right,
with heroin. At that time, the understanding in the Grateful Dead was that if anybody got into heroin, they had to leave. Right? It wasn't considered a desirable drug by any means.
I understand.
Right? And that, you know, I mean, that was. I certainly didn't want to work with anybody that was a junkie. I'd had my experiences of that with many bands, not just with the Rolling Stones. You know, although the Rolling Stones were always very, very soulful and easy to work with. I just didn't want to go down that space, so I had an agreement with Jerry that we wouldn't. That just wasn't on. You know, he assured me that wasn't on, and indeed, while I was with him, it didn't happen. How did the Grateful Dead change? The Grateful Dead changed because I used to have long meetings with the Grateful Dead, where we sat and we discussed what we were seeking to achieve.
Yes.
So it was really relatively simple. What we were seeking to achieve in the beginning was that the Grateful Dead should survive as a band. So that meant we had to work. You know, we had to be on time. We had to have contracts. We had to work. We had to make lots of money, and the money had to be paid to the bank, and had to be organised and accounted for, and taxes had to be paid. All those things that the Grateful Dead weren't that interested in doing, really. The Grateful Dead were about having fun.
Always. Yeah, that was Jerry's.
Founded themselves
right.
as a band to have fun, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of the things that I had to deal with weren't fun. It's not much fun playing taxis, really.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I know.
Not much fun going out and doing a...
Go ahead.
Sorry?
Go right ahead. You're rolling.
Yeah, I'm just saying. Yeah, all those straight things that had to be done, had to be done in order for the band to survive. So there wasn't really much choice.
I guess
it was like
the better question is, they were receptive to you when you were having to do the drudgery of getting the bank statements, getting the money, getting paid, but I mean, their ears were open enough where they understood and they listened to you. You felt respected.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, being in a band is what, is an ensemble activity. Okay? 5 people, 6 people, 7 people, 8 people, even an orchestra of 80 people. Everyone's playing together. They all have to be in tune. They all have to agree that at this point in the music, it's going to go from F sharp to B minor or whatever, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
They have to agree the chord changes, they have to agree the melody, they have to agree the vocals, this is in, normal setup, And so it's an ensemble activity. Everyone's working together to achieve a certain end, a musical end. Well, you just take that image and you expand it across the whole thing. Look, we're all working to the same end here, which is to put some bread on the table so we can eat,
Mm-hmm.
to stay alive, to pay off the car, pay off the mortgage, whatever it is, pay our bills, pay the tax man, keep everybody happy. So everybody needs to know what the plan is. That was my role. My role was, if you like, to develop the plans that would allow the Grateful Dead to survive and to retain their integrity. We could have all survived by, going and joining the Salvation Army and singing, Christian hymns of redemption, no doubt. But that wasn't particularly what the Grateful Dead wanted to do. The Grateful Dead wanted to survive by being the Grateful Dead, that unique, creature that is the Grateful Dead. So that was the requirement. And so, everybody was. It was fun, man. We were all involved in doing something together, just like the Allman Brothers were, or the band. We were all involved in the search for a peculiarly American form of music and a peculiarly American form and way of presenting that music to people. So it was exciting. Everyone was young. There was no, there was no rule book on how to do it. So there was a space for everyone to put in their ideas, and there were plenty of ideas. I can assure you of that.
Well, I wanted
to. There's a lot endless debates.
All I want to
how we should do things.
All I want to do is be in that room watching those debates. But here's the question for you: can you please tell me a good John Perry Barlow story?